The things you are about to see won't look familiar because they haven't happened yet.
This is a vision of what the skies will look like in the year 2000.
And that vision was supersonic, faster than the speed of sound.
The possibilities seemed limitless.
The future is going to be thrilling and white and pure and silver in the sky and very fast indeed.
It looks like the future had landed. It looked like the future of all commercial air travel would be supersonic.
By 1969, science fiction is becoming science fact. As international competitors jostle to win the supersonic race.
But just around the corner from 1969, boy, there are troubles ahead.
The supersonic race is about to fly into a perfect storm of money, politics, espionage, and tragedy. By 1969, the race to produce a commercial supersonic airliner has become a three-way fight. Communist Russia is first into the air.
The Soviets have got their supersonic airliner flying and it's broken the sound barrier and it's all systems go.
But Europe is close behind.
Concorde prototypes are flying, they've broken the sound barrier.
While America is still making up for lost time.
The Americans are behind. The big, giant swing-wing airliner is cancelled, and a new version is now put into prototyping.
Now, these prototypes need to be developed into practical commercial aircraft. Because that's where true success and money lie.
It was now the battle for who would dominate the commercial aviation industry.
To win, Concorde needs airlines to start beating a path to their door to buy the new superjet before Russia or America muscles in.
This was probably the most significant flight of all, because the time had come to sell Concorde.
Concorde requires a branding process. What these manufacturers are selling is speed.
The Concorde prototypes take this vision of a supersonic future on the road in a worldwide tour to drum up sales.
But also to try and entice the general public and the airlines into accepting the notion that supersonic is cool.
They went to South America, Japan.
Concorde is showing that it can fit neatly into existing airport environments.
There are special trips to Asia, a trip to Australia.
Africa, Europe, of course.
At every city that Concorde visited, there were huge crowds and traffic jams. Everyone wanted to see the future of air travel.
It's like a rock star.
The globe-trotting effort put into Concorde's branding pays off big time.
This notion of supersonic flight was so exciting and so glamorous that airlines said, yeah, we'd like to buy it.
By the end of the tours, Concorde has 76 options to buy from 17 different airlines. Now they need to develop the prototypes into a regular production aircraft before the competition gets there first. America dominates commercial aviation. They should be Concorde's most dangerous competitor. But they've lost the supersonic race into the air. So instead of backing out, they double down.
So the goal then became, if we can't be first, we're going to be best.
Boeing's revised 2707-300 is going to fly at Mach 2.7. More than 1,800 miles per hour, over 30% faster than Concorde. That would make the trip from New York to London in a little over 2.5 hours. But its killer stat is that it will carry double the number of passengers.
This is a commercial airplane, so it had to succeed in the commercial market. And the way to succeed was to fly a lot of passengers for a long distance.
This is supersonic flight, supersized. But supersizing comes at a super price.
Everything is new, everything is a challenge. And with that, everything costs money. The government was pitching in $1 billion to build this airplane. Investment was huge.
But Boeing faces a problem even bigger than its billion-dollar budget. And unfortunately, it's triggered by America's other crowning technological achievement, the Apollo moonshot.
In the 1960s, people had so much confidence in technology and science and looked at this bright and shining future. And the SST became really the symbol of that, along with Apollo.
3, 2, 1, 0. We have commit.
And then the United States launched Apollo 8 in December of 1968, and it orbited the moon.
They took this beautiful picture of this blue marble surrounded by the vastness of space. This had an incredible impact. And all of a sudden, people looked around and they saw pollution. The air over our cities was dark with smog and the waters were polluted. And then we realized that the byproduct of this drive to technology was harming our world. It was harming us.
And few things symbolize this technological excess more than Boeing's 2707 SST, the supersonic transport.
The SST became a rallying point for all of these groups who were concerned about the environment. And these environmental activists continued to become louder and attracted the attention of politicians who then rallied against the Boeing 2707.
In 1971, Congress finally caves in to the mounting pressure.
The Americans pull the plug.
The billion-dollar 2707 is dead. America's supersonic dream is over.
With the Boeing 2707 out of the picture, Concorde and the Tupolev 144 are left in the battle for the supersonic title.
Russia's record-breaking supersonic airliner is finally revealed to the world in June 1971 at the Paris Air Show.
Un des plus grands shows pour le monde économique qui tourne autour de l'aéronautique.
The Tu-144 had an ambition for export sales, including perhaps outside of the traditional Soviet sphere.
There is already an order for a fleet of Tu-144s from the Soviet airline Aeroflot. But if Russia can lure in Western airlines as well, they could steal customers from Concorde's bulging order book.
The Western press quite quickly dubbed the Tupolev 144 the Konkordsky, and it's not hard to see why.
The name says everything really, actually, doesn't it? They saw it as a kind of rip-off of Concorde, and that led to all these suspicions of espionage.
To outsiders, Soviet spying on Concorde seems to have paid off. But it's a sham. The Tu-144 may look like a fully functional airliner, but beneath the sensational skin, the prototype has serious flaws.
The position of the engine was very close to the main cabin, causing overheat of the rear part of the fuselage. The simple wing was very unstable at low speeds.
The Russians need espionage now more than ever.
So they kept stealing secrets from Concorde because they had to improve their plane.
In September 1971, just 3 months after the air show, a British spy spills the beans.
Jimmy Doyle was an electronic engineer working on Concorde. He was contacted by the Soviet embassy, and he soon became a spy.
He was not at all motivated by ideology. It was in fact just the money that attracted him to selling secrets to the Soviet Union. He in fact remarked on how easy it was to gain access to sensitive information and then pass it over.
He recalls that he just needed to take the documents on Friday, then he met the Soviet spies.
Doyle passes his briefcase of secrets to his Soviet handler for the weekend. Then, he returns the copied documents on Monday morning before anyone notices they're even missing. No one knows what combination of spying and intense engineering gets them there. But just 2 years later, it looks like the Russians have stolen a huge lead on Concorde, because they claim their revised plane is ready for full commercial production. At the 1973 Paris Air Show, this new Tu-144 goes head-to-head with Concorde.
The Tupolev 144, the first production model, made an appearance. But the Concorde was the pre-production model. This was important to the Soviets as a way to emphasize that they were farther ahead.
And it's clear the Soviets have been very, very busy.
The Tupolev 144 that arrived in Le Bourget was very different from the prototype. The main difference was the canards, those sort of mustache in front of the plane that compensate for the basic design of the wings.
The shape of the wing, the angles have become sharper.
The engines are mounted farther from the airframe, and that allows to overcome the overheating issues. It was, in fact, a new airplane.
But just how good is this new Soviet miracle plane?
Sunday is the last day of the air show. It's the day of the showdown between Concorde and Tupolev 144.
This is a gladiatorial contest between these two great machines.
The first plane to go in the air is Concorde.
The Concorde shoots up into the sky. It's utterly thrilling.
Now it's the turn of the production Tu-144 to put the prototype Concorde in its place.
For the Soviets, it was the occasion to prove the quality of the Tupolev 144. It's very impressive with the 4 engines at full power.
The Russian plane wows the crowd.
At the moment of the very last pass over the runway, the plane starts a very steep climb at 4,000 feet with full power.
Unexpectedly, the Tu-144 goes into a steep dive.
We don't understand what is happening. It just disassembles and explodes in the air.
The Tu-144 collapses onto a village on the edge of Paris and kills 8 people.
There was an investigation between the French and the Soviet governments.
They couldn't find anything specifically wrong with the aircraft. And if nothing is specifically wrong with the aircraft, then automatically people assume that it was pilot error.
But big questions remain about why the plane breaks up when the pilot tries to pull out of the dive.
It just was obvious that the machine could not cope with the forces acting on it.
Why is it so apparently fragile? The answer may lie in a declassified CIA report published the very next day.
What's interesting here is that Westerners who had the opportunity to inspect the Tupolev have reported shoddy workmanship and outdated avionics.
The aircraft had structural faults.
Despite the crash, Russia pushes ahead with the Tu-144. But they've got their work cut out. Because the flawed airframe isn't its only weakness compared to Concorde.
Concorde's operational abilities comes from the engines. The engine in this case, the 593, is the Olympus, built by Rolls-Royce.
The only other supersonic aircraft are experimental or military. And to fly that fast, they spray extra fuel into the exhaust of their engines to make extra power. It's called an afterburner, and it eats fuel. So they can only maintain supersonic flight briefly. Concorde is different.
The secret of this aircraft to actually fly supersonically is the intake design.
Jet engines would be destroyed if they breathed in supersonic air. Concorde solves this problem using a revolutionary air inlet. Inside, movable computer-controlled slats create shock waves that cuts the airspeed to just 500 miles per hour. And as a bonus, increases air pressure into the engine. And that changes everything.
Concorde only needed to use afterburners to accelerate. It didn't have to use afterburners to maintain supersonic speed.
It's called supercruise. It means Concorde uses a lot less fuel, so it can go a lot farther. The Russians have nothing like this. Unlike Concorde, the Tu-144 must run its fuel-guzzling afterburners throughout supersonic flight.
They go supersonic for a short period of time because they ran out of fuel. It only had about a 1,500 nautical mile range, whereas Concorde was in excess of 3,000.
It looks like what the Soviets really need for their Tu-144 is a Concorde power plant. But according to the secret archives of KGB defector Vasily Mitrokhin, they had already stolen the plans to Concorde's Olympus 593 engine. The restricted archive, held by Churchill College, Cambridge, is the sole source of what experts believe are some of the KGB's darkest secrets.
It's extraordinarily sensitive still for the UK government today. There's absolutely no way that you can take photos of it and disseminate it in the public domain.
Calder Walton has spent more time studying it than almost anybody else. It contains claims about one of the KGB's most valuable assets. A British citizen codenamed Ace.
Agent Ace provided 90,000 pages of classified records to the Soviet Union, a staggering amount of information, including, perhaps most importantly, Concorde design.
The files provide a wealth of detail about this unknown agent.
Agent Ace was born in Hong Kong in 1909. He was trained as an engineer, and then his career progressed within British European Airways.
And buried in the Cyrillic writing, Mitrokhin names the man he claims is Ace. The other personal information matches up exactly with this identity. It is a name that has never been released before.
These notes reveal, as clear as day, that Agent Ace was a man called Ivor James Gregory. And among the secrets that Agent Ace stole were the Olympus 593 engine made by Rolls-Royce. That's the engine of Concorde.
If the Soviets have the plans for the Concorde engine, why don't they simply make their own version?
An engine itself, it's not the kind of thing that you can go spy and steal something and let's build one. It doesn't work that way. It's much too complex.
It's possible the plans Ace stole may ultimately help the Soviets develop better jets. But an engine that can supercruise like Concorde never makes it into a commercial Tu-144. It seems that stealing plans is just not enough on its own. You still need time, and lots of it. Concorde seems on course to triumph. But it's about to run into a stumbling block that no one can engineer their way out of.
It's truly sensationally noisy.
One of the great deciding factors in the future of the SST were these issues of the sonic boom.
Like all sound, this sonic boom results from an invisible pressure wave.
The air builds up a shock wave. The energy that you've contained in that shock is released in the form of acoustic, which is sound. So we hear that slap like that.
And that boom carries far and wide.
An airplane flying supersonic, they could be dragging a 50-mile wide sonic boom along with them for the ride.
And it's not as though this could possibly come as a surprise to the supersonic pioneers.
The FAA wanted to determine if people in the United States would accept sonic booms. So they came up with the idea that over a period of 6 months, they would bombard Oklahoma City with sonic booms from 7 a.m. till noon every day, 7 days a week. There were 4,500 or so complaints with damage claims. There were 147 broken windows in downtown businesses. You know, this is glass falling down now to the sidewalk.
And in fact, one farmer said the sonic booms prevented his chicken from laying eggs.
Complaints got to be so intense that they finally said, no more, stop this, knock it off. It resulted in a class action lawsuit against the United States of America.
For years, everyone ignores the problem. But once there is a working supersonic airliner, the US government can't hide from the chorus of complaints.
So in 1973, the Americans ban overland supersonic flight in American airspace.
When the United States banned supersonic flight over land, pretty much the rest of the world followed suit.
Concorde had 76 planes reserved by airlines. But the places those airlines wanted to fly to start to disappear.
And it just became worse and worse as time moved on. But it couldn't fly over here, it couldn't fly over there. Where was it going to fly?
Have the British and French backed the wrong horse? Because Boeing, whose epic 2707 crashed and burned on the drawing board, have gone down a very different and very successful route.
The end of the SST, it might seem like a tragedy, but it really isn't. Because Boeing had another airplane in development. You had this giant airplane that could carry twice as many passengers as any other jet. That in itself makes it economical.
Boeing's giant is taking the aviation world by storm. The 747, affectionately known as the jumbo jet.
It's built a bit like a bus, but the supersonic transports were built more like sports cars.
Ultimately, it was the subsonics that would be the future of civil aviation.
But the British and French have spent over £1 billion developing their supersonic dream. So they just push on. In 1976, 14 years after planning began, Concorde finally begins commercial flights. It's not a 747, but it is one amazing plane.
Alors, pour la première fois dans l'histoire aéronautique, un avion supersonique allait transporter des passagers. C'était vraiment une grande première.
The only time passengers really felt the great warmth from the power of Concorde was on takeoff. It takes a while for that great power to get going, and then down the runway and up fast.
Le Concorde était le rêve de tous les pilotes. Il représentait quelque chose d'exceptionnel et de vraiment magique. Cet avion se pilotait vraiment avec 2 doigts, évidemment très sensible. Il fallait être très doux dans le pilotage, mais il était très fin comme avion à piloter. Là, on avait entre les mains une Formule 1 de l'aviation.
But Concorde doesn't have the supersonic world to itself. Less than 2 years later, Russia's Tu-144 also enters service. Is it going to rain on Concorde's parade?
Как это все будет?
По мировым стандартам пассажирский самолет должен налетать миллионы километров, прежде чем подойдет к...
While Concorde is flying more than 3,000 miles across the Atlantic every day, the Tu-144 service is less ambitious.
It was put into operation on limited civil flights between Moscow and Kazakhstan.
That's only 1,900 miles, just over half Concorde's transatlantic route, but all the fuel-guzzling Tu-144 can manage.
The flight itself only operated once a week.
And even those journeys are fraught.
Those that flew on the Tu-144 came back only with horror stories. The aircraft basically was never really finished inside.
And encountered various maintenance issues, such as toilets not flushing.
The lighting would fail.
Window blinds not staying open.
There'd be unexplained noises.
Blaring alarms that couldn't be shut off.
People were looking over their shoulder, thinking what's going to drop off or go bang.
Over the course of just 102 flights, the Tu-144 suffers more than 226 failures, 80 of them while it's in the air. The one scheduled service survives barely 6 months. After just 55 passenger flights, the Soviet supersonic airliner is cancelled. The Tu-144 is gone. The Boeing 2707 is gone. Concorde is the last surviving SST. But it still can't catch a break. The overland supersonic bans, coupled with spiraling fuel prices, are a catastrophe for Concorde. No one is buying the supersonic dream anymore.
In the end, all the potential orders of Concorde disappear. And Air France and British Airways have taken the plane, 5 for the British, 4 for the French.
These are the only 2 airlines that can't walk away from Concorde, because both are state-owned. The last Concordes actually belong to the governments, and they are paying huge subsidies just to keep them in the air. But even that's not enough.
By the early 1980s, it's very clear Concorde is not making money.
In 1984, the British government have had enough. They more or less hand the keys to their entire Concorde fleet to British Airways and walk away. What future does Concorde have now?
British Airways wanted to make this white elephant, as it was perceived then, into a money-making machine.
So they actually did a survey and they asked their customers how much they thought their company had paid for their Concorde ticket.
Most of the flyers on Concorde were business executives. Their secretaries bought the tickets, and they came up with a figure which was more than they were actually being charged.
British Airways realized that they'd been undercharging, if you like.
So they hit on the idea, okay, we'll charge what they think they're being charged.
So they put the fare up to about £2,000 per passenger each way.
Concorde fares ultimately sell for double the price of a first-class ticket. It aims for the pinnacle of the transatlantic market.
Not just traveling faster, but traveling faster in luxury.
This is now the luxury aircraft, luxury form of service. Masses of champagne, proper silverware, real proper glasses. almost like an ocean liner in the sky.
The experience on Concorde is now just as sensational as its looks.
Apart from the excitement of getting on and taking off, what was really special about it was the superb service.
Concorde is special, and there were certain people that flew on Concorde, and it was like a club for them. It was the captains of industry, the celebrities. You needed to know how to address people. You needed to know, really, about these people's lives.
Tout était optimisé pour que tout soit parfait. C'était un service première dans un avion hyper rapide.
And it's not just the well-heeled who pay the Concorde price. It turns out sprinkling around a little supersonic stardust brings an additional boost to profits.
Another form of income involves charter flights. And this is where both airlines are going to go in the 80s and 90s.
And it became a little bit more affordable for people to then go on the plane just to experience it. They didn't go anywhere. We went up in the air for about an hour or so, and they got given their certificate to show that they have flown on Concorde, they've been supersonic.
Because of the way the strategy worked, she gradually became a very profitable aircraft.
For nearly 2 decades, Concorde finally fulfills the supersonic dream.
And then in 2000, in Paris, tragedy struck, and this time in a really severe way. One of the French Concordes was flying 100 people. A fire sparked off in the undercarriage, flames shot up. They had no chance, and the aircraft fell out of the sky over a village, Gonesse.
Face à ces propos, la Direction générale de l'aviation civile réclame du temps.
There were 100 fare-paying passengers on board. All died, all crew.
4 more on the ground are also killed. Concorde's engineers race to the crash site, searching for an explanation.
It was devastating, absolutely devastating. Virtually nothing, apart from the bit of the nose, distinguishable as an aircraft.
The smell itself was the smell of death. It's quite unnerving, but you have to get on with the job.
Concorde's unblemished safety record is destroyed. What went wrong?
We had people who were looking at the runway itself.
And we found this piece of metal.
The piece of metal had fallen from a previous aircraft during takeoff. It burst Concorde's tire.
A big slab of tire hit the underside of the wing, and it blew out. A section of the wing, fuel then gushed out and ignited.
Concorde was going too fast to abort takeoff. The wounded plane staggered into the air.
It couldn't reach anything like its proper climbing speed.
And the captain says, "C'est trop tard. It's too late."
All Concordes are grounded. Many fear it's the end of the road for the supersonic dream. But no one who has worked on Concorde wants to see its career end in a fatal ball of flame. engineers begin a major safety overhaul.
The redesign and refit of the aircraft took a year and a bit.
New tires, new fuel tanks, new wiring. If it works, Concorde is back in the game.
So what we did, we filled the aircraft up with passengers, but the passengers were all pilots and engineers. And we flew halfway to New York and then halfway back to London. And the flight went perfectly. It was total elation because everyone felt we are back. And getting off the aircraft, and in my top pocket of my shirt, my mobile phone starts to ring. And it's my youngest son, Daniel. And I pick the phone up and I start telling him how fantastic this flight's been, and just said, "Dad, shut up, have you heard about New York?" I said, "What are you talking about?" I said, "2 aircraft have hit the Twin Towers."
Concorde's test flight takes place on September 11th, 2001. One of the darkest days in aviation history. Concorde is no longer a comfortable fit in the changed world of aviation. In 2003, the airlines closed the door on the supersonic experience, and Concorde makes its final flights.
J'ai fini sur Concorde, le dernier vol d'arrivée d'un Concorde à Paris-Charles de Gaulle. Et les gens qui étaient massés là autour de nous, sur les taxiways et sur les routes, avaient des grandes pancartes parfois. Concorde, on ne t'oubliera jamais. Concorde, tu es le plus beau. C'était vraiment fou. C'était comme si leur idole était décédée et qu'ils ne la verraient plus jamais.
The last Concorde flight commercially took off from JFK, and of course it shot off over the Atlantic, and it was, to say the least, quite a lively flight. Lots of champagne. That was Concorde's world. And then this sort of moment of tremendous sadness which you could feel on board. That truly was an end to the era moment. As you got off that plane, you knew, oh, that's it. Not just no more Concorde, no more supersonic flights, and that great adventure in the sky had come to a close.
On November 26, 2003, the last Concorde to fly touched down for the very last time, delivering the plane to Filton in the UK, where it is still on display. Only one question remains. Has the supersonic dream died with Concorde? "20 years after Concorde's final flight, NASA and Lockheed Martin are tackling the sonic boom problem that damaged Concorde's chances so badly with the Quest mission and the X-59.
This is essentially a working/research lab that is looking at minimizing the sound of that sonic boom to something similar to the thump you hear when you close a car door.
The nose of the airplane itself takes up about 1/3 of the entire length of the X-59. The reason for that long design of the airplane is we want to stretch out the features of the airframe as much as possible. NASA believes that would produce a quiet sonic boom that most people wouldn't hear over their daily lives.
If it works, America, first to bow out of the supersonic race, may be the one to claim its ultimate prize: domination of the supersonic skies.
Aviation has seemed to inspire people to achieve more, to push the envelope, to go faster, farther, more efficiently. It's an industry that captures people's imagination, and it inspires humankind to want to keep developing and improving things.
Concorde, it was in service for 28 years. That was an achievement in itself. Flew several million people supersonically.
Concorde's major legacy, she is the only successful supersonic airliner ever.
And it's just amazing. You know, it's like, beam me up, Scotty, send me from here to there.
It was simply stunning to look at, but behind the looks, it was supreme work of advanced technology and engineering. It pushed technology and engineering in the aviation industry to its limits.
My son says to me, how am I going to tell my children that their grandfather could fly to New York in 3 hours, 20 minutes, and yet if they want to go to New York now, they got to sit on a plane for 8.5 hours? You know, how does that work?